In the quiet hours of August 11th, 2024, a mother and her young daughter's lives will be shattered in an unimaginable act of violence. Kiera Massenburg, a woman who had already endured more than her fair share of abuse, was about to face her darkest nightmare. Just hours after her partner, Daquan Marcado Jones, was released from jail for assaulting her, he returned to their home, bringing with him a rage that would leave 2 lives lost forever. For Kiera, the nightmare wasn't new. For months, she had been trapped in an abusive cycle, desperately trying to protect her 6-year-old daughter, Zoe, from the violence that plagued their home. Daquan's violence was no secret. Kiera had tried to escape before, but each time, she was drawn back into the toxic relationship. She had reported the abuse, but the system had failed her, and now, it seemed there was no way out. What was supposed to be a chance for a fresh start turned into a horrific final act of rage. The man she once trusted, the man who should have been her partner, had become her executioner.
Now here at 4 o'clock, a man at the center of a murder-suicide had just gotten out of jail a day before the tragedy. This is Daquan Jones. Police say that he shot his 6-year-old daughter, her mother, and 2 others before turning the gun on himself. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dan Haggerty.
And I'm Lena Tillett. This is just horrific. This 6-year-old little girl is now fighting for her life. Her mother, Kiera Massenburg, was killed. WRAL's Chelsea Donovan has been digging through the suspect's criminal history. Joining us now live, Chelsea. Jones had a lengthy history of violence toward women.
As the clock ticked closer to the fateful moment, Kiera had no way of knowing that the next few hours would be her last. What did Kiera do in those final moments? Did she fight to protect her daughter? Or was she already too broken to escape? And most haunting of all, could this tragedy have been prevented? The clock was ticking, and the answers remained buried in the silence that followed. Stay with us as we unravel this shocking story and uncover the heartbreaking details of what led to this senseless loss. If you enjoy real crime stories that uncover the truth, don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us share real cases, spread awareness, and give a voice to those who can't speak for themselves. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what are your thoughts as the story unfolds? Welcome to True Crime Tales, where we reveal the crimes that shock communities and the secrets hidden behind closed doors. These are real people, real events, real consequences. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's begin. Kiera Massenburg, a 27-year-old woman from Rocky Mount, North Carolina, was a devoted mother whose life was tragically cut short in August 2024. Described by family and friends as caring and loving, Kiera's life seemed to be on a promising path until it was disrupted by violence. She had a 6-year-old daughter, Zoe, who became another innocent victim in this horrific event. Kiera's tragic fate was sealed by the man she had trusted, Daquan Marcado Jones, her boyfriend and the father of her daughter. Kiera had been in a relationship with Daquan for several years. From the outside, the relationship appeared to be normal, but it was far from it. Behind closed doors, the relationship was marred by abuse and manipulation. Kiera and Daquan's toxic dynamic escalated over time, leading to a volatile situation that would eventually end in violence. Kiera's struggles with domestic violence were not new. Prior to the fatal shooting, she had already reported Daquan to the authorities for assault. The abuse was an ongoing issue, and yet, despite the repeated violence, Kiera remained in the relationship. This could have been for a variety of reasons, including a sense of fear, control, or hope that things would improve. Unfortunately, her hope for change was dashed when Daquan's actions took an irreversible turn. What makes Kiera's case even more disturbing is that Daquan was released from jail only hours before the incident. He had been incarcerated for an earlier assault on Kiera, and his release would be a tragic foreshadowing of the violent act that followed. How did the system fail Kiera? Could her life have been saved had the authorities intervened more decisively? Unfortunately, these questions remain unanswered, and Kiera's tragic fate serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of domestic violence. In her final moments, Kiera was likely trying to protect her daughter, Zoe, from the escalating violence. It was reported that Kiera's primary concern was shielding Zoe from harm, as any mother would in such a dire situation. Tragically, despite her efforts, both Kiera and Zoe were victims in the violence that unfolded that day. Kiera's attempts to shield her daughter highlight the love and protection that many mothers would instinctively provide, even in their last moments. The question remains, what could have been done differently to protect Kiera? Could the authorities have done more to prevent Daquan's release from jail, or perhaps provide better resources and support for victims of domestic abuse? There is no easy answer, but Kiera's case illustrates the importance of providing adequate protection for individuals in abusive relationships. As for Kiera's family and friends, many were aware of her tumultuous relationship with Daquan. While some hoped for change, others were deeply concerned by the repeated abuse. However, due to the complexities of abusive relationships, it's often difficult for outsiders to intervene effectively. Friends and family can only do so much, and the decision to leave is not always as simple as it seems. Kiera's case underscores the importance of raising awareness about the cycles of abuse and providing better resources to victims seeking to escape. Zoe Massenburg, Kiera's 6-year-old daughter, was an innocent child caught in the crossfire of her father's rage. At such a young age, Zoe had her entire life ahead of her, but that life was tragically stolen by the violence that unfolded in her home. Zoe was too young to understand the brutality of the world around her, yet she found herself in the middle of an unthinkable situation. Zoe's innocence was lost when Daquan turned his violence on her, along with her mother. Zoe was critically wounded during the attack, and her final moments were likely filled with confusion and pain. Children, especially young ones like Zoe, often don't understand the full scope of violence, and Zoe would have had no way to comprehend what was happening around her. Zoe's tragic death brings to light the psychological and social consequences of children witnessing or becoming victims of violence. Even in cases where children survive physical injury, the trauma they experience can have long-lasting effects. Children exposed to violence are at a higher risk for emotional and behavioral issues, including depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. For Zoe, the horror she witnessed and experienced will likely stay with her for the rest of her short life. Had she survived, what measures could have been taken to prevent Zoe's involvement? How could she have been protected from such an experience? The responsibility for her death rests with Daquan, but the broader question of how society can protect children in abusive environments remains. Early intervention programs, better support systems, and more resources for at-risk families could have helped prevent this tragedy. Makia Page, a 27-year-old woman, was a friend of Kiera's and found herself at the wrong place at the wrong time. On the morning of the shooting, Makia was present at the house with Kiera and Zoe. When Daquan began his violent rampage, Makia was critically injured but survived. Makia's survival is a testament to her resilience, but also raises important questions about her injuries and how she managed to survive. The details of her injuries remain unclear, but it is known that she sustained serious wounds during the attack. How did Makia manage to survive in such a chaotic and violent environment? What kind of physical and emotional toll did the experience take on her? Makia's survival also raises questions about why she was at the house that morning. Was she aware of the danger Daquan posed? Did she feel safe in Kiera's home, or was she unknowingly placed in harm's way? Makia's experience highlights the unpredictability of violent situations and how easily innocent bystanders can become victims. Devontae Ricks, a 30-year-old man, was another victim who was critically injured in the attack. Like Makia, Devontae was an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. He remains in severe medical condition, and the long-term effects of his injuries are still being determined. Devontae's involvement in the shooting raises important questions about the unpredictability of violence. What role did he play in the events leading up to the shooting? Was he an innocent bystander, or was there something more to his presence at the scene? Regardless of the circumstances, Devontae's life has been forever altered by the violence that unfolded that day. The survival of both Makia and Devontae is a reminder of the randomness of violent events. It also raises important questions about how individuals cope with the trauma of such experiences, especially when they were not directly involved in a conflict but were still affected by it. Daquan Marcado Jones was 32 years old at the time of the tragic murder-suicide incident that took place on August 11, 2024. His age places him within a demographic where personal histories often include a mix of familial, social, and psychological factors that may influence behavior. Jones had lived in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and was known to those around him, but not for reasons that suggested a peaceful or stable background. Instead, his personal history was marked by a long history of volatile relationships and criminal behavior, particularly in the context of domestic violence. While specifics of Jones's childhood are not widely known, his actions in adulthood suggest a pattern of aggressive behavior and an inability or unwillingness to control his temper, particularly when it came to his relationships with intimate partners. Jones's criminal record was extensive, with incidents related to assault and battery, notably involving his girlfriend, Kiera Massenburg, who was the victim in this horrific case. His life was marred by repeated confrontations with the law, making his eventual violent actions somewhat predictable in hindsight. Jones's criminal history paints a concerning picture of escalating violence, particularly toward Kiera Massenburg. Before the murder-suicide in August 2024, Daquan had been arrested multiple times, with several incidents reported by Kiera. These prior arrests suggest a repeated pattern of violent outbursts that went unaddressed until a tragic event. In July 2024, just a month before the shooting, Jones had been incarcerated for assaulting Kiera. After spending time in Edgecombe County Jail, he was released just hours before the fatal shooting took place. This release is particularly troubling, given the fact that it was not his first run-in with the law regarding violence toward Kiera. There have been prior arrests for similar offenses, though details on those arrests remain less clear in the public record. However, it is known that the relationship between Jones and Kiera had been marked by a continuous cycle of abuse that escalated with time. Over the years, Jones's charges included multiple counts of assault, battery, and domestic violence. He had been known to physically abuse Kiera in various forms, which contributed to his criminal record. Each time he was arrested, there appeared to be a temporary break in the violence, but the underlying issues were never addressed in a meaningful, long-term way. Jones's offenses were not isolated incidents. They represented an increasing severity of violence. The cycle of abuse typically involved verbal aggression and physical violence, culminating in the fatal incident that took place in August 2024. On the morning of August 11, 2024, the crime scene at Weaver's Circle, located in Sharpsburg, North Carolina, was a scene of chaos and tragedy. Early reports indicated that the shooting occurred around 5 a.m., setting the stage for a horrific sequence of events that will unfold over the next few hours. Daquan Marcado Jones, 32, had just been released from jail after serving time for assaulting his girlfriend, Kiera Massenburg, and within hours of his release, he escalated his violence in an extreme way. He shot Kiera, their 6-year-old daughter, Zoe, and 2 others, Makia Page and Devontae Ricks, in a violent outburst that would leave the community in shock. The house where the shooting occurred was a modest residence located in a quiet neighborhood. The interior of the house was described as typical for a family home, with multiple rooms, including a living area where the attack began. Investigators later revealed that Kiera, Zoe, and the 2 friends had been in the house at the time of the attack. The victims were either in the living room or near the entrance when Daquan opened fire. Kiera Massenburg, 27, was the first victim to be targeted. She was shot while trying to shield her daughter, Zoe, who was critically injured. Makia Page and Devontae Ricks were also shot during the attack.
Now here at 4 o'clock, a man at the center of a murder-suicide had just gotten out of jail a day before the tragedy. This is Daquan Jones. Police say that he shot his 6-year-old daughter, her mother, and 2 others before turning the gun on himself. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dan Haggerty.
And I'm Lena Tillett. This is just horrific. This 6-year-old little girl is now fighting for her life. Her mother, Kiera Massenburg, was killed. WRAL's Chelsea Donovan has been digging through the suspect's criminal history. Joining us now live, Chelsea. Jones had a lengthy history of violence toward women.
Yeah, that's certainly right, Lena. Let's set the scene, though. We're here where that horrific crime ended at this home in Nash County, and that's where authorities say Daquan Jones shot and killed himself inside this home. We want to zoom in and show you that front right bedroom window. You can see evidence of that bullet hole, and that's where we understand from the homeowner, Mr. Alston, who lives inside here, said that occurred. We understand that Daquan Jones, in the early morning hours of Sunday morning, came to this house with bloody clothes on. His friend confronted him and said, "What's going on?" He said his girlfriend, Kiera Massenburg, was in his car outside asleep, but when Mr. Alston went to check on her, she in fact was deceased. This is 27-year-old Kiera Massenburg, killed Sunday morning. Authorities say her boyfriend, Daquan Jones, shot her at this home on Weaver Circle in Sharpsburg. They say he also shot their 6-year-old daughter, Zoe. Authorities say Jones didn't stop there. He also shot 2 of his friends, Devontae Ricks and Micaiah Page, both now recovering. Jones then got in his car and dropped his wounded 6-year-old daughter off here at this home on Lee Road. He then drove about 20 minutes north to this home in Gold Rock in Nash County, where he shot himself inside. Authorities then found Kiera Massenburg in his car, dead in the back seat. I found out today Jones has a history of domestic violence with Massenburg, last year threatening her by saying, "Do you think I'm playing? I'm going to hurt you," according to the Edgecombe County Sheriff's Office. And just 1 month ago, on July 15th, court records show he was arrested for felony assault for punching Kiera in the face, knocking her teeth out, and fracturing her nose.
Macchia was able to survive the assault, though she was injured, while Devontae remained in critical condition. At the time of the shooting, no one in the household was expecting such an outcome, making the violence all the more shocking. As the shots rang out, the house became a chaotic scene, with victims trying to escape or protect themselves. It was clear that the violence was sudden and brutal, leaving little room for those inside to react. The positioning of the victims at the time of the shooting suggested that Daquan acted quickly, without giving his targets a chance to fight back or flee. The fact that he was able to wound multiple people at once before any intervention by authorities underscores the swiftness of the attack. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they were immediately met with the aftermath of the horrific shooting. Sheriff's deputies from Edgecombe County, along with local law enforcement, responded to the 911 calls that had been placed during the attack. Upon arriving, they found a scene of devastation. Kiera Massenburg and her daughter Zoe were both critically wounded, while Macchia and Devontae had also sustained injuries. Law enforcement officers secured the area and began administering first aid to the victims as best as they could, while awaiting emergency medical services. The victims were quickly transported to local hospitals, with Macchia and Devontae being treated for their injuries. However, Kiera and Zoe were already beyond help at that point. As they searched the property, investigators found that the residence had been used as a temporary refuge for the victims, but the violence had shattered that safety. Daquan Marcado Jones was not found at the scene initially, which raised immediate concerns. Investigators knew they needed to locate him quickly, as he was still at large, potentially armed and dangerous. Authorities soon discovered that Daquan had fled the scene, which led them to follow his movements. They learned that after the initial attack, Daquan had driven the victims to another location in Nash County, specifically a residence on Jamie Road, where he dropped off Zoe, who was severely injured. Shortly thereafter, he returned to the car and shot Kiera before turning the gun on himself, ending his own life. The investigation into the shooting began immediately after law enforcement secured the crime scene. Investigators quickly began piecing together the timeline of events, gathering evidence and speaking with witnesses. Among the most important findings were the details about Daquan's behavior leading up to the attack. Investigators uncovered that Daquan Marcado Jones had a history of domestic violence with his girlfriend, Kiera Massenburg. He had previously been arrested and charged with assaulting her in July 2024, just weeks before the shooting. Daquan's recent release from Edgecombe County Jail was critical in understanding his mindset. Despite being released on bond, his violent tendencies had not been addressed adequately, and this was a key factor in the escalation of the violence. Witness testimonies indicated that Daquan had been increasingly agitated and possessive in the days leading up to the attack. Some accounts suggest that he had threatened Kiera and others in the past, but there was little indication that he was planning something this drastic. However, his release from jail and the proximity to the attack raised suspicions about the role of untreated rage and frustration in the violence. While some elements of the shooting appeared impulsive, there were also signs that Daquan had premeditated the violence. The fact that he drove Kiera and Zoe to a different location after the initial attack suggested a level of calculation in his actions. The targeting of Kiera and Zoe specifically indicated that Daquan had a clear motive behind the attack. His decision to drive them to another location and then return to finish off Kiera seemed to suggest that he had planned the sequence of events rather than reacting purely out of anger in the moment. Additionally, the methodical way in which he carried out the shooting 4 people and then turned the gun on himself, pointed to someone who had considered their actions in advance rather than acting impulsively. Investigators concluded that this was a planned murder-suicide, despite the chaotic nature of the crime scene. Witnesses, including Mackia Page and Devontae Ricks, provided critical testimony in understanding the full scope of the attack. Mackia described hearing gunshots and attempting to escape, while Devontae, who was critically injured, recalled being caught in the crossfire. Both survivors spoke about Daquan's volatile behavior in the days before the shooting, giving investigators valuable insight into the lead-up to the attack. Their accounts helped authorities piece together Daquan's state of mind, as well as the sequence of events that unfolded during the shooting. After the tragic events unfolded, law enforcement agencies in Edgecombe County and Nash County worked together to investigate the shootings and ensure that justice was served for the victims. Despite Daquan's death by suicide, investigators sought to understand the full extent of his actions leading up to the crime. They also worked to ensure that survivors like Mackia Page and Devontae Ricks received the medical attention and support they needed. Law enforcement's response was swift in securing the crime scene, assisting survivors, and notifying the public. In the aftermath, the local community was left grappling with the shock of the crime, and authorities took steps to increase awareness about domestic violence and the consequences of failing to intervene in such situations. The community of Sharpsburg, where the shooting took place, was left reeling from the tragedy. Many local residents expressed shock and disbelief over the events, as they had known the family and never expected such violence to erupt in their neighborhood. Domestic violence advocates in the area used this tragic event as an opportunity to raise awareness about the importance of early intervention and support for victims. Local authorities also used the incident to highlight the need for stronger measures to address domestic violence, with many calling for better mental health care, improved legal support for victims, and more effective rehabilitation programs for offenders. The tragic event of August 11, 2024, involving Daquan Marcato Jones resulted in an immediate and irreversible loss of life. Daquan's violent actions, killing his girlfriend Kiera Massenburg, their 6-year-old daughter Zoe, and injuring 2 other individuals, led to his self-inflicted death, effectively ending any potential legal proceedings against him. As Daquan took his own life after committing these horrific acts, there was no need for a criminal trial. However, the legal system did take note of the circumstances surrounding the case, particularly in terms of his previous violent behavior and the warning signs leading up to the murder-suicide. Daquan had been released from Edgecombe County Jail just hours before the shooting, after serving time for assaulting Kiera. This history of domestic violence raised significant questions about the effectiveness of the legal system in protecting victims of abuse. In the case of murder-suicides, particularly in North Carolina, legal actions are often limited after the perpetrator's death. However, there was a strong focus on how the justice system handled Daquan's prior offenses. His previous conviction for assault against Kiera in July 2024 should have raised red flags regarding his potential for violence after his release. The legal response to this incident led to broader discussions about the adequacy of protective measures for victims of domestic violence, especially those with a history of violent behavior like Daquan. In North Carolina, the law provides a framework for addressing domestic violence through protective orders, mandatory arrests in certain cases, and comprehensive support systems for victims. However, the tragedy underscored the fact that there are gaps in enforcement and intervention, particularly when offenders like Daquan are released from jail without sufficient precautions. The absence of ongoing protective measures for Kiera and her daughter highlights the system's failures in preventing violence from escalating to the point of murder. Following the incident, some legal analysts call for stronger laws related to domestic violence offenders, especially those with a history of assault. Many advocated for more stringent monitoring of offenders post-release, such as mandatory counseling and stricter enforcement of restraining orders. North Carolina has specific laws addressing domestic violence, particularly the handling of abusive relationships and cases that result in homicide or attempted homicide. These laws, under broader umbrella of domestic violence statutes, aim to prevent further escalation of abuse through several key mechanisms. A domestic violence protective order is a legal document issued by the court that aims to prevent further abuse. These orders can prohibit the abuser from contacting the victim, staying in close proximity, or possessing firearms. In cases like Daquan's, Kiera could have requested protective order, which would have provided her with legal recourse and mandated Daquan's removal from their home. However, whether such protective order was in place before the tragic event remains unclear. In cases of domestic violence, North Carolina law mandates that law enforcement officers must arrest an individual if they have probable cause to believe that a crime of domestic violence has occurred. Daquan's arrest for assault in July 2024 might have triggered an investigation, but the short duration of his jail time suggests that there was insufficient time for a thorough review of his violent tendencies. In North Carolina, individuals convicted of domestic violence-related crimes are prohibited from possessing firearms. However, in this case, Daquan's access to firearms remained unchallenged, despite his criminal history. There were no reports of a firearms ban being enforced against him after his release from jail. The failure to implement a comprehensive legal strategy to address these risk factors, particularly the lack of extended protection for Kiera and Zoe, demonstrates the challenges in the legal handling of murder-suicide cases in the state. The law may have provided tools to prevent the escalation of violence, but those tools were not fully utilized in this case, leading to tragic consequences. Following the devastating murder-suicide, the community of Rocky Mount, Sharpsburg, and the surrounding areas were left grappling with the shocking aftermath. The public reaction to the story was one of disbelief and horror, as many struggled to comprehend how a man who had already been involved in a domestic violence case could be released back into the community, only to commit such violent acts. The local community, as well as people across North Carolina and beyond, voiced their outrage on social media and in public forums. The story sparked widespread discussions on several issues. One of the most prominent discussions centered around the issue of domestic violence. Kiera Massenburg had suffered at the hands of Daquan for years, and many questioned how her previous reports of abuse were handled by the legal system. Public response. The general public expressed frustration with how domestic violence cases, particularly those involving repeat offenders, were managed by the courts. Discussion points. Was Kiera's situation an isolated incident, or was it part of a larger trend of domestic abuse cases that are not properly addressed? Another key topic that arose was a potential link between mental health issues and domestic violence. Some speculated that Daquan's violent actions could have been influenced by untreated mental health conditions or unresolved trauma. Public debate. The community began asking how mental health services could be more effectively integrated into domestic violence prevention programs. Many pointed out that domestic violence is often exacerbated by underlying mental health struggles, but the resources to address both issues simultaneously are often lacking. The issue of gun violence also became a significant part of the conversation. Many pointed out that despite legal restrictions on gun ownership for those convicted of domestic violence, Daquan was still able to access firearms and commit the murders. Gun control. The case led to calls for stricter gun control laws, particularly in regard to domestic violence offenders. There were numerous discussions about how easily individuals with violent histories could obtain guns, and how this increased the risk of deadly outcomes. In the aftermath of this tragedy, several organizations and local initiatives sought to raise awareness about domestic violence and provide support for victims. The impact of Kiera and Zoe's deaths brought the issue of domestic violence into the public eye, leading to various campaigns designed to educate and help those at risk. National and local organizations, such as the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence, NCAD, used the case as an example of the severe consequences of domestic abuse. They launched campaigns aimed at educating the public on recognizing the signs of abuse and seeking help before violence escalates. These campaigns also focus on increasing awareness about resources available to victims, such as shelters, legal aid, and counseling services. Local support groups and community centers began offering more accessible resources for victims of domestic violence. This included hotlines, counseling services, and support networks for families affected by similar circumstances. Additionally, Victim advocacy organizations work to push for more robust legal protections and better enforcement of restraining orders. The murder-suicide case of Daquan Marcado Jones highlighted the significant gaps in the legal and social systems regarding domestic violence, gun violence, and mental health. It ignited meaningful discussions that continue to shape how society responds to such tragic events. The tragic events involving Daquan Marcado Jones, his girlfriend Kiera Massenburg, their 6-year-old daughter Zoe, and the other victims on August 11, 2024, bring to light a stark reality about the dangers of domestic violence and the failure of systems meant to protect vulnerable individuals. Daquan's violent actions, which culminated in a double murder-suicide, are the result of a long history of abusive behavior and a deeply troubling pattern of criminal actions that were not addressed effectively. This case raises several critical questions about what could have been done differently and what needs to change in order to prevent similar incidents in the future. The death of Kiera and Zoe, as well as the trauma experienced by Makia Page and Devontae Ricks, serves as a reminder that domestic violence is not only a personal issue, but also a public one that requires collective action. What could have been done differently to prevent this tragedy? What is society missing when it comes to identifying and stopping violence before it escalates to such catastrophic levels? This tragedy provides an opportunity to reflect on systemic flaws in both law enforcement and societal attitudes toward domestic violence. The failure to address the signs of escalating violence in Daquan's life, coupled with lack of sufficient intervention after his release from jail, underscores a need for a reevaluation of how domestic violence is handled. There are several key lessons to be drawn from this case that can guide future policy changes and community responses. One of the most glaring issues in this case is the failure of domestic violence prevention programs to intervene before it was too late. Daquan's prior violent actions against Kiera were not isolated incidents, but part of a clear pattern. Domestic violence is a systemic issue that requires proactive, early intervention to protect victims and prevent violence from escalating. However, the lack of comprehensive support for victims and clear consequences for abusers often leaves many in dangerous situations until it is too late. Effective domestic violence prevention programs must include early detection. Programs aimed at identifying warning signs of abusive relationships are crucial. Public awareness campaigns, coupled with community outreach, can help individuals recognize red flags of abuse, both in themselves and in others. Empowerment for victims. Victims need access to resources that will help them safely leave abusive situations. This includes shelters, legal support, and counseling services. Programs must also provide long-term support to ensure that victims can rebuild their lives and move away from harmful environments. Mandatory education for abusers. Programs that work with abusers are also necessary. While these programs are often controversial, they are an essential tool in breaking the cycle of violence. Abusers should be held accountable for their actions and given the chance to learn healthier ways of managing anger, frustration, and other emotions that may trigger violent behaviors. Daquan's release from jail, despite a history of violence, raises serious questions about the legal system's role in preventing domestic violence. In this case, Daquan was released from jail after serving time for assaulting Kiera, a decision that led to the tragic deaths of his family members. This incident illustrates how the criminal justice system often fails to protect victims by allowing dangerous individuals back into society too soon. To prevent similar incidents, stronger legal measures need to be put in place. This could include stricter sentences for domestic violence offenders. Offenders with a history of domestic abuse should face harsher penalties, especially when there are multiple instances of violence. The legal system must prioritize the safety of victims by ensuring that abusers serve appropriate sentences. Enhanced monitoring of offenders. Abusers should not be released from custody without a robust monitoring system in place. Regular check-ins, tracking, and monitoring can help prevent them from reoffending. Better communication between agencies. Law enforcement, social services, and the court system must work together to share information about offenders and ensure that appropriate actions are taken to protect victims. This includes enforcing restraining orders and maintaining constant contact with those who have experienced violence. One of the most difficult challenges in preventing domestic violence is breaking the cycle of abuse. Many individuals who commit violent acts were themselves victims of abuse, and their behavior becomes a learned response to their own trauma. The system needs to place more emphasis on helping individuals break free from the cycle of violence. Trauma-informed care. Law enforcement counselors and healthcare professionals must be trained to understand complexities of trauma and its role in perpetuating violence. Providing trauma-informed care to both victims and offenders can help address the root causes of violent behavior. Mental health support. Many domestic violence offenders struggle with underlying mental health issues that can drive violent behavior. Providing access to mental health care for both victims and perpetrators can reduce the likelihood of violence escalating. While the tragic events surrounding Kiera, Zoe, and the others are deeply disturbing, they also serve as a call to action for society as a whole. The following questions invite viewers to reflect on their role in preventing domestic violence and what can be done to create a safer, more supportive environment for everyone. What could have been done differently to prevent this tragedy? This is a question we all need to ask ourselves. Could Daquan's violence have been prevented if earlier intervention had occurred? Was there a lack of support for Kiera and Zoe, even though signs of abuse were evident? How can we, as individuals, communities, and societies, act earlier to intervene in potentially dangerous situations? How can we, as a society, better support victims of domestic abuse? Victims of domestic abuse often feel isolated and powerless. How can we provide better support systems for victims so that they feel empowered to leave abusive situations before it's too late? What can be done to make sure that victims feel safe coming forward, knowing that they will be protected and given the resources they need? How can we work to identify the early signs of escalating violence before it leads to irreversible harm? Escalating violence is often preceded by warning signs that can be difficult to recognize. How can we train ourselves, our families, and our communities to identify the early stages of abuse before it becomes lethal? What steps can we take to intervene at the first signs of violence and ensure that victims receive immediate help? The lessons from this tragedy should not be ignored. It is imperative that we work together to create stronger protections for victims, implement more effective prevention strategies, and hold abusers accountable for their actions. Only through collective action can we hope to prevent the loss of more innocent lives in the future. The question now remains, what will we do to ensure that this tragedy doesn't repeat itself? If you found this story as gripping and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that uncover the mysteries behind these tragic events, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our latest stories, updates, and discussions. Thank you for joining us on this journey to seek justice and explore the truth. Together, we can make a difference. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.